Hello, and welcome to the latest program in Denton's Road to November webinar series, U.S. Elections and Global Implications in the Americas. I'm Andrea Johnson. I'm a partner in the firm's Ottawa office and global co-head of Denton's private equity group, and I've got the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. We have a wonderful program with esteemed speakers who are ready to share their perspectives on how the outcomes of the U.S. elections could shape the future of the Americas. So first we have Connor Beakey. Connor, give us a wave. Connor is a economist who heads up the BMI America's Country Risk Team in New York. And prior to joining BMI, Connor worked as an economist at Allied Irish Bank and has also worked in the Irish Revenue Commissioners. Next up, we have Jeff Denham, and Congressman Denham is a former U.S. representative for California's 10th and 19th districts. He served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, chairing subcommittees on railroads and economic development. He has also served on the Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Veterans Affairs Committees. And prior to Congress, he was a California state senator. Gordon Giffin, please give us a wave. Ambassador Gordon Giffin is a leader in Denton's Public Policy and Regulation Group. From 1997 to 2001, Ambassador Giffin served as the 19th U.S. Ambassador to Canada. In that role, he managed U.S. interests in the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, as well as U.S. collaboration with Canada on many global issues. He's on the board of trustees of the Carter Presidential Center and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. And among others, he's on the board of directors of public company Canadian Natural Resources as lead director. Next up, James Moore. James, give us a wave. The Honorable James Moore is a senior business advisor based in Vancouver, where he provides strategic advice on government affairs, regulatory affairs, and public policy across many industries. James was a senior cabinet minister in the Government of Canada. He is also one of the country's most sought-after analysts and public speakers on issues including national and international trade policy, digital policy, data economy, public affairs, risk analysis, privacy, and Canadian and American politics. He's a regular contributor to CBC, CTV, BNN, Bloomberg, and Public Affairs podcasts, and indeed, almost every time I turn on my TV, James's face is right there. And then last but not least, we have Pedro Munoz. Pedro, give us a wave. Pedro works with clients across Latin America on international M&A transactions and complex negotiations and disputes. His leadership journey includes being a congressman in Costa Rica's Legislative Assembly from 2018 to 2022, where he championed many important policies. Pedro is celebrated not only for his legal talents, but also for his engaging teaching of public international law across several countries, including China. Okay, so we are going to start off with an overview of the global landscape in the Americas from Connor. So Connor, handing it over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. If you wouldn't mind, you can probably start in the next slide. So what I wanted to do today, I just wanted to start by just drawing attention to just how strong the region's post-COVID recovery really has been. So you can see in the chart on the left-hand side there, GDP in the Western Hemisphere stands an impressive 10%, give or take, above its Q4 2019 level as of mid-year. And that outturns all the more impressive when we consider just how turbulent the post-pandemic period has been. It's a period in which, to kind of paraphrase Vladimir Lenin, which might be the first time he's been quoted in a Denton's webinar, it's a period in which we've seen weeks where decades have happened. Geopolitical turmoil, seen commodity prices spike and then plunge. Central banks have reacted with some of the most aggressive monetary policy tightening we've seen in 30 to 40 years. And then to compound matters, a multi-decade property boom in China that powered growth in many export-oriented emerging markets for the past two decades, that bubble has finally popped. The growth in the Western Hemisphere has been led by the US, where a productivity boom appears to be underway. But what's been somewhat less remarked upon has been the relatively robust recoveries in major economies south of the Rio Grande, particularly Brazil and Mexico, where growth's averaged about a percentage point or more above its 2015 to 2019 run rates since 2021. And as you can see in the table, Canada's performance has been more disappointing, particularly in light of the strong population growth we've seen north of the border, a reflection of its vulnerability to much higher interest rates, given elevated levels of household leverage and the fact that a large proportion of this debt is made up of short-dated mortgages. Now looking ahead, if we move on to the next slide, we are cautiously optimistic at BMI that the positive trends in the rest of the Americas can be sustained, supported not only by cyclical factors like Fed easing and an associated pickup in business capex, but by two key structural trends. Number one, a shift from globalization to regionalization as the commercial Cold War between US and China rumbles on, and as a series of recent supply shocks have highlighted that while it may have been efficient, the pre-existing global trade system is, or at least was, far from resilient. And number two then is the green energy transition, which is and will be supported by the rollout of substantial fiscal supports that in turn are helping to catalyze private sector investment into sustainable projects. Now, these structural trends are mutually reinforcing, with access to the subsidies that is enabling this investment into clean energy technologies contingent on beneficiaries' compliance with pretty stringent rules of origin requirements, owing largely to geopolitical considerations. Now, granted, increased protectionism and rising geopolitical tensions, that's not a Pareto efficient outcome for the global economy, and the return of inflation is a real concern. But the diversity of the Western Hemisphere economy leaves it much better positioned to function as a standalone economic bloc than, say, export-dependent and energy import-reliant Europe. If we look at the next slide, we can see that the hemisphere has been through similar episodes before. For instance, following Congress's passage of the Ford-Macomber tariff in the 1920s that raised average import duties to around 40% in an effort to support industry. And that was a negative shock that the rest of the Americas weathered remarkably well, as a booming US manufacturing sector meant that demand for commodity exports from Latin America held up despite the increased cost for US end consumers. So you can see in the chart on the right that the region actually outperformed the US around the middle of the decade, even as Europe stagnated. Now, I should say that the same was true for Canada to an extent, even though it's not included in the chart here due to data limitations. So we move on. In contrast to the 1920s, manufacturing sectors in other parts of the region are much better positioned today to share in on the spoils from the US's latest protectionist shift. Existing trade agreements, geographical proximity, and substantial wage advantages make Mexico and Central America an extremely attractive option for US producers looking to bring production closer to home, particularly in the event of a Harris presidency. FDI into these countries is already outstripping 2010 to 2019 averages in nominal terms. And while political uncertainty will act as a headwind for at least the next several quarters, and we suspect that this will prove to be a pullback in the context of a longer-term uptrend. In fact, we're actually quite optimistic that these flows will facilitate the sort of technology transfer needed for the region to boost flailing total factor productivity, which would allow for a rare trend change in growth. Now, further south, our positive outlook is more of a commodities play, but we also see substantial scope for countries like Chile, Peru, and even Argentina to exploit their dominant positions to move up the value chains in terms of the processing of metals crucial for the green transition, like copper and lithium. And that will help to reduce economic volatility, which has long been the bane of more commodity-oriented economies in Latin America. And for those countries that can't diversify, the increased US focus on the region as it tries to counter Chinese influence should at the very least present some opportunities in terms of access to concessional lending and so on, with scope for regional governments to play the two, that is the US and China, off against each other. So overall, we're mildly optimistic that these trends can be maintained for the most part, even in the event of a second Trump presidency, with the experience of his first term in office suggesting that not every policy he floats on the campaign trail should be believed. I guess, sorry for those looking for you for banking on the reintroduction of SALT deductions. But I guess that's as good of a place as any to pause and open up the discussion panel.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Connor. That's fantastic information and background. And so we're going to kick off with a question about U.S.-Mexico relations, and we're going to put our guest Joe Crowley on the spot. But first, let me do a brief intro to Joe. Congressman Crowley represented New York's 14th district for 20 years, serving in House Democratic leadership and on the Ways and Means Committee. He championed Social Security, Medicare, and the Affordable Care Act, and supported tax cuts for the middle class. He also co-founded multiple caucuses, including on India, Ireland, and rare diseases. Okay, Joe, as I said, I'm going to put you on the spot right away. Can you speak to U.S.-Mexico relations first with a Harris or Trump administration? Please speak generally first, and we're going to come back later to trade.
Sure, Andrea, thank you very much. And I'm happy to join this conversation. Sorry a bit late. I had some technical difficulties again. But look, I think that it's a complicated issue dealing with our border in particular, first and foremost. And I think both Jeff Denham and I would agree that it's one of the, if not the greatest issue right now of the campaign of the Trump administration, certainly, but certainly as well as the present Biden administration and the Harris Walz team as well. And we'll have to have some reckoning when this election is over and the smoke is cleared. As Connor just said, you can't believe everything the former president says will come to fruition after the campaign. I kind of chuckled when I heard that because I don't believe anything he says, but that's just me. Interesting enough, though, I think that will be the case. And with the new government in Mexico, at the same time having elected the first woman in the history there as its leader, it's going to be interesting times if we do the same here on our side. I do think there is. Especially, and I will give this to the Trump administration, the free trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, something that I supported, had strong bipartisan support in fixing some of the problems with NAFTA. I think there's more to be done there, certainly, and I do think helping to stabilize Mexico, and particularly in parts of the region, dealing with the drug cartels, the continuing import of fentanyl and other deadly drugs to the United States through the border itself is something that will continue to have to be addressed, regardless of who's elected president. But I think there'll be positives from both administrations, either a Trump administration or a Harris administration, look forward to in terms of dealing with the border, but also dealing with one of our closest allies and certainly our neighbor to the south, Mexico.
Oh, yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Joe. And Jeff Denham, what say you on U.S.-Mexico?
I think regardless of who the next president is, there's going to have to be an immediate resolution on some of the border politics. Both presidential candidates have committed to that. And while Joe and I think both agree that the House, U.S. House of Representatives is going to, whoever controls the House, it's going to be by a very, very slim margin, which means that most likely, as we saw under former President Trump's administration, any type of border resolution is going to have to be done. It'll have to be done administratively by executive order, but two, also with a direct negotiation to the president of Mexico and making sure that there is an agreement on those very same policies. So I expect the relationship to grow under either president. I think it's going to be critical to the next U.S. president's overall mission is resolving some of those border issues to be able to move on to other issues like we've got both have committed to tax reform, and we have a tax policy that's going to expire. Both want to also address the upcoming highway bill and do greater funding into our infrastructure. Before you can take on one of those big ticket items, you have to first address not only our relationship with Mexico as a trading partner, but also have to address the crisis at our southern border.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And Pedro, can you please give your thoughts from a Latin American region perspective?
Absolutely. Hola. Thank you for this opportunity. As former President of Mexico said, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. Really, Mexico and the United States are twin brothers. and I totally concur with Congressman Denham. It's not just about trade. It's all sorts of issues. And Congressman Crowley identified the elephant in the room. Whatever it's done in commercial terms and whatever it's done in trade terms will have a direct impact in drug trafficking and immigration. So the relationship between the United States and Mexico is very relevant to the individual person, to every person in the United States. Let me explain what Latin America is, because we talk about Latin America in very general terms. And let me compare Latin America to the United States. Latin America is 340 million, I'm sorry, the US is 640 million people, Latin America is 300, sorry. Latin America is 640 million people, and the US is 340 million people. Latin America GDP is 5.6 trillion as opposed to 27.7 trillion for the US. And GDP per capita for LATAM is 11,000, whereas GDP per capita for the US is 85,000. So you see, number one, Latin America is a very compelling market for the United States, but at the same time, the difference in income produce very clear discrepancies. Mexico's population is 125 million. Its GDP is 1.4 trillion, and GDP per capita is 11,000 as well. So if the United States really means increasing tariffs, we can see the obvious results in Mexico and in Latin America. There will be more immigration into the United States, and there will be more traffic into the United States. So we should not see the relationship between the two countries merely as a trade issue. This really has consequences in the daily lives of people in Latin America, the 640 million people, and the daily lives of people in the United States, the 340 million people.
Okay, thank you very much, Pedro. Those are important insights. We're going to switch our perspective a little bit north to Canada, just as framing up the overall issues here. So could Jeff Denham, could you speak first on U.S.-Canada relations with a Harris or Trump administration? You know, again, just generally, and we'll come to trade next.
I think that we continue to have a good ongoing discussion. I'm not sure that trade policy will change significantly, or relationships will change significantly over what we have today. I think that both candidates recognize the importance of the ongoing trade and some of those issues along our northern border. I would say that one issue that I do expect to get addressed is aviation. We've had different aviation systems between the two countries, and it's time for the U.S. to upgrade our overall our towers and the way that we track our aircraft. I think which will also improve tourism and regular flights back and forth.
Okay, thanks. And Joe Crowley, do you agree on Canada? Are the waters a little bit calmer, if not the skies?
Well, I would imagine, yeah, I agree with Jeff. There's not the same tension or stress that we have in terms of the southern border and our northern border. You know, Canada remains one of our closest, if not our closest ally. I think that will continue regardless as to who the president of the United States is or who controls Congress. You know, we're down here and interested in what's happening with Trudeau and his own positioning within his government. Reading most recently about Canada's relationship with another ally and friend of India. It's very interesting to watch in terms of Khalistan and the Sikh issue, having one of the largest, if not the largest, Sikh populations outside of India itself. It's just interesting to watch what's happening there. But generally speaking, writ large, I do think that, as I said, it's if not our closest, certainly one of our closest allies, and that'll continue to be the case.
Hey, thanks, Joe. And Ambassador Giffen, can you please weigh in on U.S.-Canada relations?
Sure. Well, we never have bad relations with Canada. It's only a question of degree of how good the relations are. I do think that we don't have a bad relationship with Canada now. It's become a little bit dormant. The engagement with Canada isn't as vibrant as it has been, let's say, in prior decades. During the Mulroney, Chrétien, even Harper years, there was much more of a dynamic between Canada and the United States. Now, I think one of the reasons is that the attention of the President of the United States and the government of the United States has been moved overseas because of all of the challenges overseas. And secondly, the government of Canada is a little insular right now, dealing with their own challenges, I think. And so the engagement isn't as vibrant as it could be. I think after this election, and I agree, there'll be some personality issues. From my experience with Canada, and Andrea, as you know, I still spend a lot of time there. Canadians are not pulling for Donald Trump. He wasn't very respectful of Canada. He wasn't very respectful of the Prime Minister. But that said, I think with either candidate for president, the task will be to reinvigorate the dynamic, not the quality, but because it's still a very good relationship. And I think we need to renew the commitment to what I call the North American community. I was part of a Council on Foreign Relations project 10 years ago or so that wrote a report that talked about, and it included Mexico, having more of a sense of a North American community, where when we're reshoring manufacturing, when we're relying on suppliers, that we ought to be causing North America to be fortress North America and sourcing things in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, making all three economies stronger, and particularly to the degree that Canada and the United States can enhance the economy of Mexico, we will partially diminish the challenges of migration into the United States. So there's got to be more of a focus on reinvigorating the way we collaborate with each other. And the last thing I'll say is, particularly with Canada right now, the United States has a significant interest, I believe, in refining our energy relationship and our critical mineral relationship with Canada, so that there's a seamless both economic and geopolitical relationship between our two countries. We shouldn't have difficulty moving energy back and forth across the border. We shouldn't have difficulty moving critical minerals, and with that goes moving people.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon. And James, over to you. Do you foresee a fortress North America in our near future?
Well, we'll see. I think Ambassador Giffen's description is quite apt. When you cast ahead, I think for Canadians, the most important sort of timing is actually not necessarily this fall. It's actually casting ahead to 2026, because we have a bunch of known knowns and known unknowns in front of us. And the known knowns that we have is to remind ourselves that policy is personnel. And whether it's President Trump again, or Vice President becoming President Harris, but also in Canada, as was mentioned, current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in a lot of trouble. He lost 2 by-elections in 2 of the safest ridings that have effectively been Liberal since Confederation. When the Liberals were shrunk down to 34 seats back in 2011, when Stephen Harper won a majority government, they held on to these 2 seats. So in a 343-seat federal parliament in the coming election campaign, out of those, the 34 safest Liberals, they just lost 2 of them. Prime Minister Trudeau is 20 points down in the polls, has a 3-to-1 net negative. It's not going well. and now backbench liberals are starting to revolt against him. So my point is that, you know, this whole conversation about where we're going to be, my home province of British Columbia, we have an election campaign going on right now. It'll be settled this coming Saturday. Saskatchewan and New Brunswick also have campaigns going on. Ontario is likely to have an election in early spring of 25, the US presidential campaign. So my point is that by the time 2026 comes around and we have a renegotiation or re-examination of the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, it'll be an entirely different set of people. And all those people will have different priorities, different pressures, and so on. One of the key economic pressures in Canada is that we are now in our 7th straight quarter of per capita GDP shrinkage in Canada. So the original chart that was shown there at the beginning is true, that Canada's economy may be growing at about 1% per annum. Since 2020, though, we have the worst economic growth record of any country in the OECD on a per capita basis that we've seen. And so Canadians have gone through this per capita recession. We've had the inflation pressures. We've had rising interest rates that are now coming back down. So people are angry. And they're angry, and they're looking to hold some politicians accountable for the tough times they've seen in their lives. So the Canada-US relationship will remain important. It's a $1.7 trillion bilateral annual relationship, of which 2/3 is net accretive to the United States, not Canada. And that story and that narrative needs to be rebuilt. So I think Ambassador Giffen his core point there in the beginning is apt for all the players who do value this relationship, that the dormant nature of the relationship cannot be allowed to sort of stagnate because false narratives about the virtues of this relationship will take root.
Yeah, and James, I'm going to put you on the spot there and ask you whether you think that it is a Harris administration or a Trump administration better for Canada from a trade standpoint. Do we believe the current Canadian government that says that they can work equally with either administration?
Very different emphases. Both will have their challenges. My personal view is that a Harris administration would be more helpful, mostly because we don't know who Donald Trump is going to surround himself with if he's going to get reelected. I imagine Bob Lighthizer wouldn't be there again. And frankly, the crew of people who are around former President Trump are pretty obnoxious, scary, and pretty out there. And I don't quite know how he would staff his administration with regards to the trade files. We'll have a bit of breathing room between now and 2026 to get a sense of things. But one thing about Vice President Harris is that she did vote against the USMCA. She was one of 10 senators who voted against it. Now, she emphasized the reason why she voted against it was on environmental concerns, that it wasn't progressive enough on that. But also, she comes from California, where there are a lot of tensions about Mexico that aren't necessarily reflective of a Canadian relationship. So she has her own narrative on trade that's different and would have a different emphasis than President Trump. But at least with Vice President Harris or President Harris, I think we would have a better sense that the function of how one would approach things with her administration would be more professional and predictable.
Okay, and Gordon, I'm going to give you the last word on the Canada topic here, but in particular, because I want you to speak to something specific, which is energy policy and nuclear, which I know is a real area of focus for you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, nuclear obviously is going through a renaissance globally. Largely because of the concerns about climate change. And obviously there aren't the kinds of emissions from generating nuclear power that you have from fossil fuels. So nuclear is going through a renaissance. And it's important to recognize that actually a Canadian-based company, Cameco, is the largest publicly owned, non-state-owned provider of uranium in the world. Uranium is a must-have component to generating nuclear power, obviously. So Cameco is now becoming a remarkably important player, again, out of Canada in the global world of nuclear power. Cameco has developed a lot of business and a lot of opportunity in the United States. So again, the collaboration between Canada and the United States is very important. The United States, have enacted bans on Russian uranium. Russia is a big provider globally of uranium, and we are not supposed to be using Russian uranium in the United States, which means that we either need to mine more of it ourselves, and most of the operations in the United States were shut down quite some time ago. So once again, Cameco is quite important to that opportunity. And Cameco, interestingly, along with Brookfield, another Canadian-based enterprise, bought 100% of Westinghouse, whose technology is one of the 2 or 3 technologies being used in nuclear power plants today. So people really don't realize the extent to which Canada has become an enormous player in the development of nuclear power around the world. The United States is on a path to approve a meaningful number of new nuclear generating plants, but it's going to be expanded to Europe and so forth. And the American business community, Westinghouse and others, in collaboration with Canadian interests, Cameco and Brookfield, are going to be an enormous part of that growth. So that's something significant that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention. I will say, as a corollary, you didn't ask about fossil fuels, but Canada and the United States also need to reinvigorate our work on collaboration on fossil fuels as well. Fossil fuels are not going away next year. They're not going away 10 years from now. They're going to be part of our economy, part of our society for some time. And the challenge is to use fossil fuels responsibly as we go forward, and to work together to collaborate on how you phase down the volumes. It's silly to have 2 different policies or 3 different policies in North America. Once again, the North American community. We need to have collaboration on the development of the policies, and we need to have collaboration on transportation of fossil fuels through North America, Canada to the United States to Canada, getting it to our coasts. Europe needs a lot of LNG. Canada's got a lot of natural gas, but you don't seem to be able to build pipelines to get the natural gas, certainly to the East Coast. We can build the facilities in the United States. So there are ways to, again, collaborate in being the most dominant, now I'm talking about North America, the most dominant energy provider, including the Middle East, in the world. It just takes some strategic thinking and some collaboration.
Yeah, and thanks, Gordon. That's those are really important comments, and you know, to have a completely different set of issues, right? I think we should shift our focus back to Mexico, right? Because I think there's a real contrast here in the issues to be dealt with down south, right? I'd like to turn to Joe Crowley to comment on from a trade standpoint and Mexico in particular. How does the environment change when we're looking at potentially very different tariff situation on exports? Can you talk about Mexico, winners or losers? What happens in a new tariff environment?
Well, I think for every action is reaction. That I don't know if that's calculated in terms of the former president's approach to trade and to tariffs in particular. That the concerns here by many economists is that any imposition of tariffs will eventually trickle down to the consumers here in the United States, and will be a tax that they'll pay, or will be an increased fee that they'll pay for consumer goods. So I do think that is a concern, from my perspective. I don't think the tariffs are necessarily the answer to all issues, although that seems to be the former president's reaction so far in this campaign. As James had indicated, I think it was James, or maybe it was Connor, that everything that's said in the campaign doesn't necessarily come to fruition. But I do think that what you are really facing here, and it's not one-sided. Both Democrats and Republicans have been adding fuel to the fire in terms of the relationship between the United States and China. And much of this and the focus on the issue of tariffs has been directed towards China. But I do think that it'll be interesting just to see how that develops in a post-election period. I do think that with Harris, that it's not going to necessarily be focused on expansion of tariffs, although you have seen much of the policy of Trump remain in place during the Biden administration. I think there'll be more tempered approach to that when it comes to trade between the United States and China, and I would suggest between the United States and Mexico as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And Jeff, I'll give you the floor on trade, or Canada, maybe Mexico going to be collateral damage in a trade war with China. What happens next on the trade tariff front, and in particular in relation to Mexico?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Joe said. I do think that with a special relationship that we have with both Mexico and Canada, that they will be the first things that get worked out. I mean, we already have great trade agreements now. Trump feels like they were a great success, and I think that he uses everything as a negotiation. I think that's what is going to happen with the tariffs. He's talked about tariffs. He's willing to negotiate them away. He'll do it for industries. He'll do it for countries. But that doesn't mean that it won't be a painful process for members of Congress that have different commodities that get shipped across the world from their districts. So I do expect it to be a big political hot potato if former President Trump is reelected. But I do think that it would get worked out with Mexico and Canada first.
Okay, and Pedro, what are your thoughts? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I am a realist. Mexico has to get its act together. I think both Harris and Trump pose a threat to Mexico, but Mexico's #1 enemy is Mexico. Very recently, Mexico enacted a very substantial reform on the judiciary, and that has made investors into Mexico very concerned. Just yesterday, the new elected president of Mexico met with very important investors because she wanted to confirm that the investments that they had committed to were going forward. Mexico presented assurances to them that they should not worry, and at the same time, the investors gave Mexico the benefit of the doubt. So just yesterday, $20 billion in investments were confirmed. So basically, Mexico and the United States, as I said earlier, are too important, and they are twin brothers. It's very difficult to sever them. But Mexico needs to make sure that it does the right thing, because other countries in Latin America are waiting for Mexico to make a mistake, to make themselves visible to the United States and say, hey, come here. So I think we all need to be very careful, very cautious, and starting with Mexico. That's the reality. So I'm neither a pessimist nor optimist. I'm a realist. And starting with Mexico needs to make sure it does the right thing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. And over to Connor. And Connor, what I'd like you to comment on is, of course, all of these policy changes that potentially impact Canada and Mexico are being undertaken to benefit the U.S. economy. What is your prediction on the sectors of the U.S. economy that are potentially going to win or benefit, depending on, in either case, like whether a Harris or Trump administration is in place?
Sure. So, I mean, in the short term, the impact's totally dependent on how far and I guess how fast and realistically we can say Trump here, because tariffs mean Trump. Harris is not going to introduce more tariffs. But if Trump implements tariffs in such in a way similar to, say, the Nixon shock in 1971, we get an overnight imposition of a 10% universal tariff. Maybe we get that 60% special levy applied to China. And if that happens, our modeling suggests that the US will fall into recession. And it's important to note that this modeling doesn't even take into account the potential for a pretty large pickup in financial market volatility. And even if it's a more gradual affair that results in kind of a modest increase in tariff rates like we saw over 2018 and 2019, it's dragged out over a period of time. And the US may not necessarily fall into recession, but sectors like manufacturing that, these tariffs are purportedly aimed at supporting, they'll struggle on the back of weakness in private sector sentiment, and just as the private sector delays CapEx projects until that uncertainty declines. And I think in terms of the longer term impact, what I would say is that one of the great ironies of post-World War II US trade and industrial policy is that two of the more notable attempts to save the US manufacturing industry, Nixon through protectionism in 1971 and Reagan through deregulation and tax cuts a decade later, both of those attempts ultimately contributed to the sector's decline via their knock-on effects on US interest rates and on the dollar. And we have some real concerns that Trump's proposals will result in a kind of similar outcome, and particularly given that these seem likely to be paired with a pretty expansionary fiscal policy. So if we assume the Fed remains independent, that's a recipe for much higher US interest rates and a strengthening of the dollar that could conceivably offset much of the impact of the tariffs, like it did over the course of, or I guess in response to the US's most recent protectionist shift in trade policy that's been underway since 2018. Now, there is a risk that the tariff or that the administration could look to talk down the dollar, and we've seen J.D. Vance and Trump float this themselves, or even in a more extreme case, implement some sort of cross-border financial transaction tax that would be an attempt to kind of dissuade inflows. But given that roughly 30% of outstanding treasuries are held abroad, we suspect that would also be a decision that officials would very much regret. So I guess kind of getting back to your original question, I'm coming to a close now. But in terms of the specific sectors that would benefit, the key takeaway is that in aggregate, the US manufacturing sector isn't likely to see much upside from the sort of broad measures that Trump himself was proposing. Though if I was pressed, at a subsector level, electoral considerations, existing subsidies, and fairly strong possibility that Trump cajoles foreign producers into locating more production facilities in the US in an attempt to kind of repeat what Reagan did in the 1980s. And I guess it's important to remember here that Trump's views on trade seem to have very much been shaped by that experience in the 1980s. And all of those factors suggest that autos in particular would be the big beneficiary of any major protectionist shift in US trade policy. But in aggregate, it's bad news.
Yeah, and so Jeff Denham, I mean, the Trump tariff proposal, is that going to create the desired renaissance in U.S. manufacturing, or is it a recipe for a recession?
I don't think it's a recipe for recession, because I think that he's going to be strategic on what those tariffs look like. It's a negotiating tool for him. Where it becomes painful is when you're trying to address inflation and you're having a big impact on our farming community. If you start seeing retaliatory tariffs that are put on us, it could make things very, very difficult for us here at home as well. I mean, there's give and takes with both. When you're fighting inflation, if our cost of goods is going up due to a tariff war, it could really be a challenge.
Yeah, and Joe Crawley, what do you think? Connor says that Harris is not going to impose any significant tariffs. That's not part of her idea of how to do things. What do you think the future holds?
I agree with that. That's not been her positioning at all, and I do think that trying to maintain or to diminish inflation in the States here is multifaceted. Certainly the role of the Fed and its independence and its decision to lower interest rates recently has had some impact, but it really has been the job growth, and we continue to see, counterintuitive growth in jobs despite the rise in interest rates. So, and now recent lowering of it, we'll see what the impact that will have. But there's no question that adding, as I said before, for every action there will be a reaction. We don't know what that is. We won't. They're not going to tell us what they're going to do. But we can't look at this as though we're the lone player here, and that whatever decision we make will not have a reaction somewhere else, whether it's in Canada, Mexico, China, or anywhere. And so I do think that increasing any tariffs, as I said before, will have a direct impact on the U.S. consumer. and in some respects will be a tax that they will have to pay, or an increase in the cost of living, and the increase in cost of living is inflation and inflationary, and will add to it. The former president says that's not the case. I haven't seen any answers to what would indicate it's not the case. Simply by him saying it isn't the case is not going to make it not the case. So we'll wait and see. I'm hopeful he's not elected president for a lot of reasons, not the least of which I don't know where he's going in terms of the relationship between the United States and China, and that's not clear to me.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So James, even if the situation, economic situation in the U.S. Gains or benefits from an administration, Canada, if Canada is going into a tariff situation with across the board significant tariffs, the Royal Bank of Canada chief economist estimates that Canada could be in a situation of losing 2.5% off GDP, right? So that would be a fairly severe recession in Canada if that came to pass. That wouldn't be spread evenly, of course. So James, what would be your prediction for which sectors would lose or have the most to worry about if we're looking at a Trump tariff situation?
Well, certainly the manufacturing sector and what's left of the auto sector in the province of Ontario, number one, right? 1 in 3 Canadians lives in the province of Ontario, but 1 in 5 Canadian jobs is dependent on trade with the United States. It's about 60% of New Brunswick's exports, 25% of Ontario's. But the manufacturing sector is the backbone of the Ontario economy, and the backbone of the manufacturing sector is the auto sector. So that would be an obvious hit right there. But the thing too, and it sort of draw back to 30,000 feet though, that should it be President Trump again, is that, he's a bit of an enigma because his understanding of economics is shaky. His explanation of tariffs and what it constitutes in terms of a revenue flow to the government is bizarre. So he has a perception of reality that isn't reality. And you kind of have to dance in that world and sort of accept things that may not be true as true in his eyes for the sake of a broader and more important relationship. And with regard to Canada and the United States, I mean, there's also the dynamic of NATO and Canada's contributions to NATO, national security, continental security, and our defense spending dynamic, where Canada could do a lot of things that would be accretive to the Canada-U.S. relationship reputationally with the Trump administration that go beyond the whole narrative around tariffs and borders and efficiencies and all that. Because I do think Donald Trump views the America's partnerships with the world, that if you do something for us that would be beneficial to our security framework and our trade framework, in our intellectual property framework, then we will give you a pass on some other fronts. In the United States, the truth is, as a Canadian, the truth is the United States has been giving Canada a pass when it comes to national security defense spending for decades, and Canada has taken that sort of that policy and that approach by the Americans, frankly, for granted for far too long. And you see some polling data now in Canada where Canadians recognize that. And should Pierre Poilievre become the Prime Minister of Canada, that a lot of Canadians expect him to close the gap on 2% of GDP spending on the NATO commitment to be closed by him. And most Canadians are actually supportive of that. Now, we'll see if they're supportive of that when they see what that constitutes in terms of scale of spend, which is close to $40 billion per year. But that can be spent in a lot of ways that would be beneficial to the Canadian economy in terms of having a longer tail on R&D, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think the Canada-U.S. relationship does need to be understood certainly in a Trump context, but I think for Vice President Harris as well, that I think he sees the relationship much more than just dollars and cents, GDP, jobs back and forth, but that if America is going to continue to be the superpower in the world, we want others to do more in ways that would be accretive to the United States. And I think that there's room to dance there for Canada in protecting the relationship.
Okay,
Could I comment to that, Andrew, real quick? Sure. I just want to say I don't disagree with James on that commentary in terms of the commitment to NATO. But what I think is important for certainly our Canadian friends in particular understand is our positioning, the U.S. positioning in terms of NATO and our troop existence in places like Italy, Germany, South Korea, Philippines again, that our troops are there altruistically in many respects to help our allies, but they're also there selfishly for the protection of the United States. They're there post World War II, and I don't want our friends to think that that's lost on many Americans. We understand that. I think Canada also understands it and shares that positioning as well. And it's right that countries do pay their fair share, and we should be driving them to do that. Not threatening to withdraw our support from NATO in that way, not threatening or not asking potential enemies to do their will, because we're not going to protect or to follow through on our commitment to NATO. And I'm talking specifically to Russia as it pertains to Ukraine and our other allies within the region, Poland, not the least of which are part of that. So I think it's important for us to understand why we're in NATO, what circumstances created it, and not to look at this solely as we're doing the world a favor, we're doing ourselves a favor by being in those regions.
Yeah, and I'll kick that over to Jeff Denham, and maybe is the case that Canada, Mexico, Latin America, the thing it can do to help itself, right, is respecting America's priorities on security, right, and global roles, and doing our bit to contribute. Jeff, what do you think?
I would agree with that. I think both of our borders, it's important to make sure that we are doing everything we can to increase trade. Both for the U.S., but as far as our partnering countries, they're our #1 trading partners, and we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to continue to respect that relationship. But as well, on our southern border, we've got to come to a resolution, not only on the impacts of the border crisis, but also we've got big transportation issues down there that we need to address as well. The wait times for many of our goods movements back and forth across our southern border have had huge delays, and it's going to be part of our overall transportation project.
Yeah, and Pedro, you've said that much depends on Mexico getting it back together, as you said, right? Like what exactly needs to happen, and who's going to lose out if it doesn't happen?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to show my other slide. As Henry Kissinger used to say, America has no permanent friends or enemies, only interests. And this is pretty much how the Latin American political map is looking. Blue represents more to the left, and red represents more to the right. I think the map is pretty eloquent. I don't need to go into it. Now, American foreign diplomacy into Latin America is very clear, dependent on America's interests. I mentioned the effect on trade. I mentioned the effect of trade on immigration and drug trafficking, but also there is a relationship with politics and natural resources. Venezuela, for instance, provides oil to the United States. So it seems like the Biden administration hasn't cared much about how the Maduro government is mistreating the people in Venezuela. And it doesn't mind that there were not fair elections and that there were actually rigged elections. But the United States, regardless of the United States Latin American policy's motivations, the United States has to remember that every action has a reaction, as it was said earlier. And it is true that the poor will always have with you. That is, Latin America have the poor people. If those poor people are not provided real opportunities, I'm glad that nuclear energy was mentioned, cheap, affordable, clean energy, access to technology, access to healthcare. And if the United States does not care and help for the Latin American population to get all that, then there will be a reaction, and that reaction may not be what the United States is looking for. So we are all together in this. We need to improve the lives of our people. And if we don't do this together, then we are all going to suffer the consequences. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Pedro and we're about to do parting thoughts, and that's probably a good one. Connor, any parting thoughts?
No, I mean, I guess my big takeaway, I mean, there's going to be a lot of focus on the USMCA moving forward, and I just really emphasize that we at BMI agree with Congressman Denham in that we are of the view that most of the threats we've heard from Trump are a negotiating device, and that the trade agreement itself will remain in place, and that the sort of tariffs more generally that Trump is promising to implement, that a lot of them may not come to fruition. But as I said, when we went through the economic impact, even if those tariffs don't necessarily materialize, it's still the negative impact of the threat on business sector sentiment could act as a modest drag on growth, on global growth, that is.
Okay, thanks, Connor. And James, any parting thoughts? I mean, you're familiar with politicians sometimes saying things only for dramatic effect and not necessarily planning on following through. What do you think?
No, never.
Yeah.
So you said that you're not going to build the wall and have Mexico pay for it, and no, like everything is subject to change. And I guess I'll close with where I began, right, which is to say that policy is personnel, right, and all the personalities are subject to change, whether it's Sheinbaum, Trump, Harris, Trudeau, Poilievre. The mix of all these different personalities and the pressures that they're going to face at home is going to dictate, I think, a lot of the policy that's going to come out of the back end of it. But the truth is, I think that everybody does understand underneath, but maybe we need to reanimate the understanding of it, is that the North American platform of Canada, Mexico, and the United States is the most prosperous and successful trading economic relationship in the history of the human race. It has never been prosperous, a more prosperous arrangement than that. And we need to make sure that it's bolstered against some of the worst elements of it, whether it's sort of creeping greenfield sites and Chinese dumping of goods, or intellectual property theft, or a sense that everybody doesn't do their part with regards to security and information sharing. We need to actually make sure that it is understood that this relationship has been beneficial to all three parties. And as we move forward to 2026, beyond 24, keep in mind that personalities come and go, politicians come and go, but truths remain, and that truth needs to be reasserted and reanimated with real aggression.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, James. And Joe, before we turn to Jeff for a sign off, what's your parting thought?
No, I think James said it well. I do think that certainly the relationship between our two closest and trading partners, as well as our two closest allies, it needs to remain strong. We have our challenges at our southern border, and certainly with our friends in Mexico, and also recognizing what Pedro had said in terms of Mexico's internal challenges and the political strife that is there. Hope with a new dawn, with a new day, with a new president and new leader, that some positive change can take place there as well, that will inure to the benefit of the people of Mexico, as well as to people in the United States, needing to also address the issues south of Mexico. The reasons that people are being driven to the United States, regardless of whether it's Venezuela, and I agree with Pedro. I think a stolen election is an understatement. We're dealing with a severe dictatorship there that I think is a concern not only to the United States, but ought to be a concern regionally as well. But that we need to be really addressing why there's a human outcry need to come north of their borders to the United States. Simply by wishing them away is not going to do it, and wishing them to stay in an environment that is deadly or not productive is not going to be helpful to those states and nor to our region. So we have to figure this out.
Well, thank you, Joe, and Jeff. I'm going to do you the honor of giving you the last word.
Well, thank you, Andrea.
I want a rebuttal.
Not in the rules.
Great discussion. I think that it's important for all to understand the great relationship we have with our partners to the north and our partners to the south. The election is right around the corner, but the two biggest issues remain that it's about the economy and about immigration. That's what's on every voter's mind. That is what both presidential candidates have had to focus on. And regardless of who wins this election, those will be the top two issues that have to get resolved first quarter of next year. So look forward to the opportunity that we have to strengthen our relationship with our partners to the north and south.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks very much, gentlemen, for your wise words, and we wait with bated breath for the election results.
And thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.